Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm excited to share with you my conversation with a fellow podcaster and public historian, Shae Corey. Shae has lived and worked in D.C. for the past 5 years and is currently pursuing her doctorate in 20th century American history at George Mason University. Shae's research primarily focuses on religious activism's impact on the development of D.C. neighborhoods. She prioritizes community, histories, and creative storytelling in her academic practice. We sat down to discuss her oral history project turned podcast, Wholly Local, and the challenges that come with producing such a project. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, joining me today is Shae Corey. She is a public historian whose podcast, Wholly Local, explores faith and community in one Washington, D.C. neighborhood and will be one of the topics of conversation today. Welcome, Shae.
Thank you, Alicia, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. So, let's dive into this podcast. What prompted you to produce an oral history project as a podcast?
That's a great question. And my background is in oral history, so it felt pretty natural to me. And one of the things working in oral history in the past is that, you interview these people and you have this amazing audio. And then if you're producing something for the public that's in a written form, you really lose a lot of the quality of that interview, because the point of doing an oral history project, in my opinion, is to have that personal touch and that personal history that comes out when you can listen to the person talking about something, especially if you're talking about a major event in their life or something that's more emotional. You can really, feel it as a human and share that experience with them in a different way when it's in an audio format versus a written format. So when I was approaching this project and I knew it was going to be oral history based, I wanted people to be able to hear the individuals that I was speaking with. So a podcast made the most sense to me. And I think I was able to do that and incorporate a lot of those real, community voices in a more tangible way than if it had been a paper or something else in a different format.
Yeah, and I think what I thought was so lovely about the approach is the accessibility factor, right? Because so many oral histories are out there, but they're locked away in archives or under paywalls, and a podcast is a way to kind of make it ubiquitous. Anybody can access it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so your project focuses on the Church of the Saviour. So can you give us a bit of background about the church and its members?
Absolutely. So the Church of the Saviour was started in 1946, 1945, 1946. And it was started by an individual named Gordon Cosby, who had served in World War II as an Army chaplain. And he had been very involved in that war, really changed his perspective on how Christianity should be lived out in an individual's life. He experienced a lot of death and tragedy in World War II, and that shaped his response to living a life that really mattered and had an impact on as many people as possible, and kind of making your life count. And so he and his wife and a few other founding members started Church of the Saviour in Washington, D.C., and their goal was really to represent Christ in the national capital and also make an actual impact in the community around them. And they were able to do that through the creation of over 75 nonprofits, a lot of which are still very active today in that DC neighborhood, Adams Morgan. And they've had a real impact on kind of the ability of that neighborhood to retain very diverse demographics with, ethnicity, socioeconomic, all these different factors that other neighborhoods in DC that have suffered from more severe cases of gentrification have lost that diversity. And so those nonprofits really help keep people in place in a way that doesn't exist in some other DC neighborhoods.
And, you begin the project with kind of a thesis. So can you share a bit about your thesis and what conclusions you were able to draw from your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the thesis for me primarily about wanting to understand how that church had such a big impact on the neighborhood and what the effects of that human effort had on the community. I think, you know, speaking for myself and maybe a few other people, there's this sense of pessimism, I think, in certain types of community activism, and this idea that, we aren't really in a place to actually affect change. And I feel that when I was looking at this church in their history, I was really inspired by their ability to make real change happen, not just in their lifetime, but kind of this continuing legacy of impact that they had and that helped so many kinds of people. And so the thesis and the question that I was orienting around was, how did this religious group create, these organizations, and how did that impact the lived experience of people in that neighborhood, both historically and in the present? I was also, kind of philosophically thinking about different questions around loneliness, community, and, the loose decline of religion in American cities. So I was thinking about a lot of things, but the thesis was oriented around how those religious nonprofits impacted the neighborhood of Adams Morgan.
And so that is a perfect segue to my next question, which was, how did the Church of the Savior really impact the lives of its congregation?
In so many ways. And, the podcast, I tried to include a lot of different types of people that were in the congregation. So I think, as a clarifying point, the Church of the Savior was not a traditional church. They had a very unique approach to religious practice, and it was more of a lifestyle than, they wouldn't just show up on Sundays. This was a very, it was integrated into their daily life. And so there were a lot of things that members had to do in terms of giving financially to the church, and the church was using that money to purchase buildings and create programs and, again, fund a lot of these nonprofits and different services for the community. They were really involved in, art projects and food, language services, all these types of things that the community needed. And so they were having a really big impact, not just on themselves and kind of their spiritual development. They were living in community with each other, but they were also living in community with the larger neighborhood. And one of the interesting things that I trace throughout the podcast is this interplay that they have with the community, because they're very religious and in a kind of hippie-ish way, a little bit metaphysical, like kind of out there in terms of how you would think of religious practice in the 50s. But they are really involved with themselves, but all of their effort is geared externally. So they're wanting to interact with the community, have the community present a need, and then they respond to that need. So one example, which is a little bit later in their history, was with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. They were one of the first groups in DC to create a space for people to receive, like, caring medical help and assistance, and essentially created a house for people to come to and, like, receive medical attention and emotional support in a time when people were not receiving that. And that was a need in the community that they immediately responded to and were able to build a space for that and help people that desperately needed help in the neighborhood and in the city. So they had a lot of different effects. A lot of the nonprofits individually had specific, purposes and missions, but they were really responding to community needs and helping people really directly in a way that might be a little bit hard for us to conceptualize. But I just think that was one of the most fascinating things to me, was this interplay and this relationship that they had with their community members, both in the church, but also outside of the church.
Yeah, I think the one of the episodes that was most powerful for me was the discussion around the civil rights era and the closure of the foster home, or orphanage rather. And I thought, oh gosh, here they're trying to be of service and try to attack an ill, right, a societal ill, and yet it doesn't always turn out the way that they want to. So I'm just curious, how were you able to find in those moments where maybe they wanted to do something and it didn't quite achieve the goal that they had set out, like, what was the reaction there?
I think that's such a good question, and I really struggled with the orphanage episode because, the best intentions can go awry, and it's really different to have somebody who was impacted by goodwill in a negative way,
Right.
right? And that happens, especially with, like, race relations in that time period. A lot of people were trying to do the right thing, and it wasn't helpful to other people. And so
Right.
it's that's a really fascinating episode, and it was really hard to figure out how to present that without, not wanting to offend anybody, but,
Right.
needing to tell that part of the story as an essential perspective. And I think there were definitely other organizations that, especially now, I think they have different relationships with the community because what ended up happening and the way that the church approached the creation of these nonprofits with Gordon Cosby as their, head pastor and their leader in a lot of ways, they would create the nonprofit in response to a perceived problem. And then Gordon Cosby's approach to it was, if it's if it's run its course, we have to let it go. And so that, I think, has been a struggle more recently as well, with people not wanting to kind of let things end or let things adapt. And that's not with all of these missions, right? There are certain missions like Jubilee Housing, which have been able to continue providing essential housing services and all sorts of things to people. But again, there's still community issues with that, right? Because when we're in community with people, whether it's organizational community, nonprofit community, personal community, whatever it is, there's going to be issues because not everybody's going to feel the same way, and people's needs are constantly evolving. So I think it is a difficult spot that they tend to be in, where you're responding to a current need, but then also there's the issue of continuing
Right.
providing that service and all the difficulties that that poses in a modern era with taxes and all, all this kind of
Yeah.
practical concerns, but then also the modern concerns of people aren't always going to agree, and the needs are going to change, and who's providing it might need to change. And I think those are really difficult when you've been in place and in a neighborhood for so long to adapt to that. And a lot of the services have, but I'm sure, there have been some that have either struggled with that or had to back off in a sense. But I think, I just think it's hard, but I
Yeah.
think they've done their best, and, I think we can at least give them credit for that.
Yeah. Well, and this project really focused on the Church of the Savior. So, are there any plans to maybe expand and look at maybe other community relationships with their local religious institutions?
Yes. So I have my main problem in life is I have a lot of things I want to create and do. And of course, I am a limited human being. But my main question that I have in my head, and what I'm working towards researching, is the religious landscape of DC and how these churches, all types of churches, and just religious institutions in general, it doesn't have to be Christian necessarily, how these institutions affect the neighborhoods around them, and how this general decline in religious institutions is affecting the city at large. So that's kind of my big research interest and question in relationship to DC, because this is the city that I love, and I just want all my research to be about DC. Um, but I think that there's just so many of these stories. I was reading a news article a few days ago about a church, that a historically African American church, that shut down in, unfortunately, I don't remember where it was, but it's in DC, and it was talking about how they'd been working really hard to preserve this church structure. They only had, 20-ish members that were still attending, but they had to shut down because of these, physical issues with the
Mm.
building. And it was like a $2 million repair.
Oof.
So they had to, like, shut down the congregation. But the line in the article that stuck out the most to me was they were talking about, it was this one sentence, it was a list of all of the services that the church had provided that were also shutting down with the congregation. And it was like school supplies for children, language learning center, education center, food bank, like clothing pantry. There's all these services that are tied to these institutions. And when they're shutting down either, for a variety of reasons, right, and those services are disappearing, how does that affect the community and the neighborhood that they're in? So that's my interest in what I'm working towards and a broad DC landscape, and trying to incorporate a variety of denominations in that. But that is, I think it does have a huge impact. I can't fully prove it yet, but but I'm working on it.
Well, and let's take a step back and talk about process for a minute. How do you put an oral history project together?
Oh, yes. It's a special journey. It's really hard, as you know, since you run a podcast. Audio is exhausting
Yes.
to edit and put together and create. And there's the added pain of having to listen to yourself talk for an extended period of time, which I've gotten a lot more used to, but is still jarring every time I turn it on, and I'm like, oh, there I am. So with the oral history process, it's also complicated because oral history is, from my perspective, when you're doing it right, it's a formalized historical field, right? Yeah. It's not just interviewing. It's a very different process from a traditional interview. And there's a lot more considerations in terms of, the legality of it, and then also all these different ways that you want to make it accessible to people. You might want to archive it. There's just so much going on from the oral history side. And then to take all of that kind of mass of audio and translate it into a tangible product, something that people would actually want to listen to, is really difficult. But like I said, I felt that it was worth it because I wanted people to be able to hear the individuals actually telling their stories. I think that can happen in oral history projects too, is it kind of removes that human aspect and turns it into this, larger narrative. But I wanted individual people to have a chance to share what they thought and their experience and have that be the driving force behind the narrative. And it was a difficult process. It took me a long time to kind of do. What I ended up doing was I did all of the oral history interviews, which was around 12 or 14 maybe.
Oof,
and
yeah.
then I, went back through all of those, figured out what I wanted to pull, and then I had to essentially condense all of those interviews and all of the other research I had done and like stretch it out into a chronology, which
Right.
was really hard because with oral history, you get, maybe 3 or 4 different versions of every story. So you have to wade through that and use other sources to confirm the factuality of dates or events or certain things that 3 people said happened, but one person doesn't remember. So it's like a weird process for sure.
Well, as somebody who's done a few oral histories in my career, my least favorite part of doing it is writing up the transcript.
Yes, it's painful. It's not fun
because you have that fine line of, you don't want to track every or pause, but you want to give them their voice and make sure it's representative of what they said. That I did a few for my thesis in graduate school, and by the time I was done with the like, I think it was like five or six interviews, I was like, okay, I'm done. So the fact that you did 12 to 14, hats off.
Thank you. Thank you. It is nicer now. There are a lot of different, transcript software. I used to have to do them just sitting here like I am with you with my headphones on and a little foot pedal to stop and start the audio. But now you kind of get that general transcript. You have to edit it and listen to it and all that, but it's a little bit easier.
Yeah.
But.
Well, and just thinking about the challenges, you've already kind of touched on a few of them, but what are some challenges that you faced putting this project together?
It's difficult to essentially I don't want to say create a history. I would say pull a history from a lot of different sources. And then also there wasn't necessarily an existing historiography, right? Like when you're doing community history, it can be difficult to contextualize your work because it's not like there's, 7 history books written about the Church of the Savior and I'm contributing some new aspect. Like there's nothing. There's a few books written by church members and those are helpful. I use those, but I have to both organize the story, but I have to actually contextualize it in the history of the time. So that was something that I have a lot of background in DC history, so it wasn't too much of a heavy lift for me to do that. But I did have to figure out where their events were happening in relation to national events and DC events. So that got really confusing. And that's why I ended up kind of being forced into doing it chronologically, is because I could find no other way to organize it, both mentally and physically. It was really, I spent like months trying to figure out how to tell the story, both from a history perspective and then also in a way that would make sense to listeners and also to the church members, because I made it as a public product and I wanted people to listen to it and to kind of create this conversation around community and religion. But I also was making it for them. I wanted the church members to have this resource to be able to point to and say, these are all the things that this is like our history and this is what we've done. And so it was a fine line to walk, I feel, where I wanted to tell it accurately, but it was difficult to do that when you're using a lot of personal history. You have to add in that social, economic, political context. And it was a mess. So it was really hard to figure it out. But I think the chronology was really helpful.
Yeah.
And it was kind of the only way to do it that would have made sense, I think.
Well, especially doing it kind of as a solo project, not having an institution behind you, like you got to do what works.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's tough to be the only one making the choices.
Well, and then the one thing that I thought was really cool about this oral history project / podcast is that it also comes with a companion digital exhibit. So can you talk about this exhibit and what visitors can expect when they visit?
I almost asked you to remove this question, but then I thought, this is a great learning experience to share with people, which I had thought about before I created it. So the digital exhibit is currently compromised. When you're doing digital history, something that you have to think about is the sustainability of your digital work. And so I created it on a platform that had existed for nearly a decade, and they shut it down. So I have to essentially rebuild the digital exhibit on a different platform. So it's currently not available, but there is a very bad PDF of it on my website if you would like to look at a very bad PDF. But I am working on reconstructing that and hopefully adding in some other elements. It was primarily a map of all of the nonprofits that were still in existence in DC, and it included a lot of photos and kind of some more historical context. So unfortunately, it's under construction at the moment. But I just thought it was a good thing to mention that if you are embarking on your own history project, and it was something I did think about, I just wasn't paying close enough attention to the fact that they were shutting down that entire platform. So just something to consider. I mean, I do have different copies of it that I can edit, but yeah, just keep it in mind that the internet is constantly changing. So something to remember.
Good tip. Good tip. And so you are trained as a public historian. For those who may not know, what does a public historian do?
Oh, we do so many things. It's a really difficult field to categorize because what people traditionally say, which I'm always like, well, duh, it's in the name, is that we create history for the public. And that's true, we do, but there's a lot of different ways to do that. So when people think of public historians, you can tend to think of people that are doing curation or programs at museums, nonprofits, uh, all sorts of organizations. There's so many organizations and niche jobs that you probably don't even know exist, but a public historian is probably doing it somewhere, like categorizing the files of like how cheese was made in the 1700s. Like somebody is doing that somewhere probably, and it's probably a public historian or somebody who is writing the social media captions for the National Park Service. Like a public historian could do that job. They're typically trained in a lot of practical methods like digital history, oral history, curation, exhibitions. Like there's all sorts of things that you can kind of specialize in as a public historian. But at the end of the day, you have a broad set of skills that you can use to present things in a public rather than an academic context. You can technically, most people do both and you have that academic background, but you're doing things for an audience in a sense, in a way that's different from doing things in the academy where it's more of an ivory tower situation. You're preaching to the choir in a sense. With public history, you want everybody to listen or see what you're doing, and you want them to be able to understand it. So it's a different type of writing and presentation than a more formal thing.
Yeah, I always think of more traditional academic historians are writing to engage in conversation with their colleagues, and public historians are really trying to engage in conversation with the general public and trying to make history accessible.
Yeah.
Okay, so you recently started a PhD in American history. So, if you weren't busy enough and you didn't have all of the ideas, you went ahead and embarked on what will be a challenging yet rewarding journey. What do you hope to do with your additional training?
Oh, that's great. Here I am, semi bad mouthing the academy, and I'm actually back inside of it. I so I decided to do my PhD. I mean, I'd always wanted to do it and I kind of put it off. And I've always wanted to do it because I've always wanted to create, um, public products with kind of more academic background, not in the sense that, I'm creating things for an academic audience. I always want what I do to be publicly understood and accessible. It's more that I also want the academy to recognize my work in a different way and to have the opportunity to spend the time doing the type of research that I want to do. Like in my last job, I was really lucky and I'm so grateful that they were able to allow me to do so much independent research and do things that I wanted to do in kind of my spare time. It wasn't a part of my job, but to be able to have that freedom and that agency was really great. But it kind of, sparked this fire in me of wanting to do that all the time. And so with my PhD, I obviously have different obligations, but it's primarily geared around what I want to research and how I want to approach things. And I have a lot of time and space and energy that I get to dedicate to creating scholarship that I want to be accessible for people, like the church history work in DC, the religious landscapes, kind of studying both the decline of churches in the 20th century, but also for me, it's not focused on decline. I'm really interested in all of the amazing things that these churches were able to create and what we might lose if we're losing the churches. That's why I wanted to do it. And a lot of my research will still be in the religious community, oral history realm, but I just wanted to be able to really focus a lot, pretty much all of my time and energy towards the type of research that I was really interested in. And I am lucky enough to be able to do that full time, and it's really exciting. And it's also scary, but I it's fun. It's been more fun than scary, but it's definitely a big commitment and a big jump into an uncertain future with the humanities in general. But
Yeah.
that's been true even if I wasn't doing a PhD, so I might as well do what I'm really interested in doing, because I would probably be scared either way with the state of affairs. But
Well said. Well said. Well, good luck, and
thank
I
you.
look forward to what public products you bring out during your journey. And so, turning back to your research for just a moment, how does learning about Americans' connection to religion kind of help us understand our current moment?
Oh, this is such a good question. I could talk about this for a very long time, but I'll spare you. I feel I feel that in today's world, and probably honestly, probably all of time, religion has been interpreted in a variety of ways throughout all of human existence, but it's always played a very central role in the life of society, right? Like, even in countries that had these larger shifts towards atheism, like in France, religion played a major role in building up to those like revolutionary ideas, right? So when we think about history, religion really informs a lot of our ideas about morality. It informs our ideas about how we interact with people. It informs ideas of immigration and like all these things that exist in society have at least some connection historically to religion. And primarily when we think about service and charity, which is kind of one of the historical subjects that I'm really interested in, it is deeply connected to religion and religious institutions in America. And so for me, I like to use religion as a way to understand how humans have attempted to connect with each other over a really long period of time and how these ideas about God have shaped, these really temporal interactions that we have with each other. And I just find it really interesting. I like to think about how people see the world and how that impacts their interactions with each other. And I think for me, religion is the way to analyze that. And I just think it's so fascinating to think about how it's evolved over time and how people have used it in so many different ways. And so I just find it really fascinating.
And I think at least some of that comes through in the podcast. So, in terms of communicating a message and a thesis, I think you did a really great job there. And the podcast was released last year. I know you just started a PhD, which is probably going to take 142% of your time. But are there any projects that you're currently working on that you want to talk about?
Yes. So, as part of my PhD, I am working with the American Religious Ecologies Project at George Mason University. And it is a really cool project. And so we're working on basically using a lot of church data from 1926 to interpret these religious landscapes in America. And so it's a really cool website. You can go look at it. I wasn't previously involved, but I am working on that now. And so a lot of my work research for with the university will be in that realm. But also, while I'm doing that research, personally, I'm looking at a lot of kind of the ways that the DC landscape has changed over time with
Mhm.
religious histories, and eventually hoping with kind of both the personal and professional sides of that work, I would love to start creating public products with those churches, like whether that ends up being videos or audio interviews, like articles or things like that. That'll probably be what I create next. I also have been really intrigued by, I've been learning a lot about denominations recently, which obviously I knew a bunch of different denominations existed, but it's actually very complicated. And so I've been thinking about different ways to creatively like organize that, whether that
Mm.
would be in a zine or like some type of funky, interactive thing just for my own brain to be able to process the denominations and how they're connected within the Christian faith. That might also be something that I'm interested in. I have a lot of ideas. I just also have a lot going on, but that's kind of, I think, where I'll be going next. And a lot of that would be coming out of my website or my social media platforms. Just sharing those things on there, whatever whatever they end up being. But it'll probably be related to DC, of course, and um, churches and denominations is kind of what I'm looking at, and change over time, all those fun things.
Which that is actually a perfect segue to the next question, which is where should people go to learn more about you and the work that you are doing or hoping to do?
Yeah, so my website is probably the easiest place to find me. I also feel like I'm relatively Googleable, but it's just shaecorey.com, and I have a lot about the podcast on there. I also have some different like creative projects I've done before. I really like making zines. That's something I would like to do more of, like history based zine creation. So I have a few of those on there that I've done with different projects. And then I just have more information about me and what I'm doing. And I'm just today, a year after this podcast has come out, it is on Apple Music now. I've been teasing it for a year. I just never did it. But it's up there now. So
Nice.
if you're an Apple Music fan, it is there.
And where should people go to when they finish the podcast and they're looking to get more information about, the church and its impact in the Washington D.C. neighborhood?
So, there are a few different resources that I used to learn about the church, and I would say the digital exhibition, but as we've discussed, that's a goner at the moment. So the Church of the Saviour actually has a really great website called inwardoutward.org, and they have this phenomenal sermon archive that are like all of Gordon
Mm.
Cosby's sermons and different, speakers that they had at the church, which I used a lot of those in the podcast. So when you hear Gordon, that's from the sermon archive. And there's just a lot of really great information about the church on there, both their history and what they're doing now, links to all of their different nonprofits, all of that great stuff. There's also a few different books that were written by Church of the Savior members. Called a Commitment is probably the one that has the most like church history in it. And so those would probably be the best places to start. And I think I probably have a few of those links on my website as well. But those are great places to learn about the church and all that all that great stuff.
Wonderful. And so before I let you go, is there anything we haven't discussed that you want future listeners to know?
All I would say is that this is a weird roundabout story that I'm about to tell. So I'm taking a political history class this semester, and I don't care for it. But I am really glad I'm learning a lot because it's really changing my perspective on things, even though it's not something I'm really interested in, but it's been really great to be exposed to a different type of history and to be exposed to different perspectives. And I think when a lot of people hear about religion or religious history for a variety of reasons, a lot of which are very valid, a lot of people have trauma, all that, background. I understand that, but I do feel that listening to and being exposed to different perspectives on religion, religious history can be really helpful and informative in how we view and understand the world. And so I would just encourage you, if you're religion shy, maybe just give it a chance. From a history perspective, not any other perspective from me. But I just think it's a really critical and important thing to understand in our interpretations of the world in the past. And I think more people should give it a chance. So that's all I would say to future listeners is it's not proselytizing.
Yeah.
It's history, and it's really interesting to hear about how people lived their lives, and that's I think why a lot of us like history is we want to know. We're nosy. We're like, what
Hmm.
were they doing back there? So that's how I view it.
Wonderful. Well, to the listeners out there, be sure to check out the Holy Local podcast wherever you listen. Apparently now newly on Apple Music.
Finally.
And definitely check out Shae's website. She's a fantastic public historian, and I think she's going to do some great things as her career progresses. So, Shae, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I had so much fun.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Shae for coming on to the show. You can stream Wholly Local wherever you get your podcasts and can learn more about Shae by visiting her website. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you Saturday. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.